Wonderful, wonderful. That's enough about creatives. We've got a couple of bankers on the stage now to talk about the market. A couple of bankers with a B to talk about the state of the market. What matters a huge amount to all of us in this room is how do we build not only great, successful production companies producing brilliant, creative events that we've talked about for the whole of today, but how do we make sure those are sustainable and profitable? And boy, haven't we gone from feast to at least a slight whiff of famine. I'm Kamal Ahmed. I'm the presenter of the Daily Tea. I'm only one vowel away from being president of the United States. I'm the director of audio for the Telegraph. I worked previously at the BBC for many years, and I started my own business, The News Movement, with William Lewis, who's now chief executive and publisher of the Washington Post. I am joined, though, by three titans in this area. Jane Featherstone. Sadly, Jane, I don't have a jar of honey to give you.
Disappointing. Richard does, though.
Which is a little bit disappointing, but Richard, I think you're going to be able to supply some honey later, because Richard, very similar to David Beckham, not only in his footballing prowess, but also is a honey maker, as is Sir David. Jane Featherstone, who is co-founder and CCO of Sister, and Jane, basically the person behind every single program that I've ever watched. So thank you very much for that. I'm incredibly grateful. Harry Hampson, who is Hampson, sorry, you are handsome as well as being called Mr. Hampson, global chairman of EMEA at JP Morgan, but most importantly for us in this audience, an expert in media M&A, having just piloted the All3 Media deal, which is very, very exciting, and Richard Sharp, to my left, not politically necessarily, but certainly geographically on this stage. Former chairman of the BBC. When I worked there as editorial director at BBC News, Richard, we had many, many important and interesting discussions when you were there. Now at SW7, the asset management business, but with a great eye to how we consider markets, technology, innovation, and also the role, Richard, I think, which we will get onto, which is what is the correct balance with this amazing ecology we have in the UK of the public service broadcasters and a vibrant private production and independent production market. But Jane, I wanted to start with you as hugely successful person in the independent production space. We had a great chat yesterday about how the industry is feeling from your perspective. And maybe you could just share with us some of the key challenges, given the tone of this, as I said, sort of this whiff of famine is too strong a word, but we had the riches that were pumped in, particularly by the streamers, particularly during COVID, has abruptly changed. What has been called the correction has happened. How has that affected you, and how do you see the present UK environment?
It's quite a big question, isn't it? I'm going to become a beekeeper. That's definitely the answer. I'm going to go back a bit further. I'll be really quick. But the context of this shift that's happened, this structural change, when the terms of trade were instituted 20 years, how many somebody better than me can tell me when that was, but around 20 years ago, and Channel 4 funding a lot of independent content, as with the BBC and other public service broadcasters, we built in the indie sector businesses based on that. The model was a license fee model with distribution, and in a hit, you made enough money to sustain your business through the downtimes if you were lucky enough to do that. Over the years, and particularly since sort of 2018, 2019, and this is just the way the market has evolved, is that we're now, we moved to a cost-plus model from the streamers plus the license fee. That there was a twin track of those for quite a while, for a few years. And now, there was a lot of inflation of budgets. There were too many things commissioned. I think there were 1,400 shows in Britain commissioned series in 2022 or something, and now it's down to about 1,000 again. So there was probably too much. There were too many companies, potentially, you could argue, that were trying to service that, and now we're coming right down again. So we're in a place where the license fee model for us as indies is very, very challenged, because working with the BBC and Channel 4 and ITV, who are great partners, the license fee that they can give us, because budgets have risen, largely driven by, you know, getting movie talent in above the line, that expectation that it wasn't really TV anymore. They were long movies, you know, novelistic pieces, pushed all the costs up. So we're in a state of change, and I'm really alert to, you know, there aren't that many indies in this room, but they'll be reading all of this. This has been a difficult few months in particular. Some have closed down and people are losing their jobs. So it's hard to sit here and talk about value, but we have to find the green shoots, which we'll talk about. So that's the state of the industry, and producers like me are trying to navigate how we have a mixed ecology and what that looks like, and how that has to be for us supporting the public service buyers, that has to be, and supporting the cultural sector. So we're in this structural change where there will be, and Harry and Richard will talk about this more, consolidation of some kind in order to get us through this. So that's the state we're in, and it's definitely challenging. There's no question about it. We're making a lot less for doing the same, which is worth saying.
And Jane, do you feel, you know, you've been in this industry for, you know,
35 years.
Number of decades. We're similar vintage, although you look much, much younger than I do, which is slightly irritating. But anyway, is this just a market correction that the industry needs to go through? Or is it more than that, which has meant that actually there are some risks to the way we produce, and downside risks to the way we produce content in the United Kingdom?
I think it's a market correction. I don't really like that term, honestly, because the market's evolving. So you don't want to correct it back to what it was, because we're never going backwards, but we have to evolve into a different future. I think the risks are that we lose storytelling at the edges, and that we aren't able to tell the stories regionally, and that we aren't able to give voices, which we all want to. I believe everybody here wants to do that, to give voice to those people who need to tell their stories. But there will only be so many slots, and when you're driven, when the budgets are challenging for us to make, I think things will move more to the centre. However, I do see some opportunity in that further down the line. So yes, I think it will, for a period of time, change the creative. And there's nothing wrong with being in the centre. I've built an entire career doing that, and I've been very lucky to do that. But normally, things in the centre start at the edges and come into the middle.
When I first came into reporting on this industry, when I became media correspondent of The Guardian in the 1990s and then media editor, there was this new young company called RDF, which was doing this thing called factual entertainment. And they had all these amazing things, and it was quite controversial. And of course, they have just announced that they are, you know, they're being shuttered by Banijay. I mean, is it, when you say everyone's going to the centre, Stephen Lambert has spoken about a kind of top tier of maybe 12 or so big players, and then what have been described at times as true indies, sort of, you know, in more niche markets, looking for, you know, great new ideas and being very entrepreneurial, but at a smaller scale. Is that how you see the model developing?
I think, well, talent will, alongside the technology and alongside the market forces, also drive that. And there's we all know around this table that, you know, any business you value, it's about the talent involved, and Richard knows that more than anyone, but how important that is. So I don't think it's as simple as that sort of zero-sum game, but I do think there will only be so many slots. And actually the transparency, none of us in this room really know how many slots are available for the indie sector. And if there are 800 companies and 600 slots, you know, what are we looking at here? And we have to face that reality at some point, which is really tough. So there will be changes, and I think those companies who have bandwidth, strength, investment will be able to survive these storms more easily. There's no question about it. But then it's our responsibility to partner with those newer companies, to partner with that talent, and to make sure there are still roots in, which is what the BBC and Channel 4 and Netflix do, you know, with newer talent. I know, you know, Anne works with brand new talent all the time as well, and Supercell is an example of that. But we have to really actively protect that, I think, and make sure that that ecosystem survives.
Harry, still attractive, obviously, all three media. There is still value in the market. just tell us a bit about the All3Media deal and why that was so attractive.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is I'm the only one not wearing a tie, so who's the banker here?
I'm not wearing a tie.
No, well done.
Also on this stage.
No, I think I'm aware of how difficult things are at the moment, but I have to say that in general markets are becoming more optimistic. There's definitely a sense that as interest rates come down, the economies are going to recover, and so that is typically a time when people want to invest. Sort of to anticipate, if you like, the recovery. So although I'm very sensitive to the current situation, I would actually be optimistic if I were all of you, because what we found in All3 and Jane's there, was a lot of interest. I mean, it wasn't just one party; it was 15 parties who were serious. So, and why are they serious? Well, because it's a business of scale. It's obviously a leader. It's one of the largest producers. It's got a fantastic roster of talent. It's got a fantastic library that obviously underpins the value. And there were a lot of people who are very attracted, not just Americans, but a lot of international parties that were attracted to what All3 represented, which was, was a business that was supplying, broadcasters and streamers around the world. So, and that is because of what's been built here in the UK primarily. So I'm an optimist. I think what we found in that process, it's like selling your home. If you want to sell your home well, you've got to get numerous buyers to get interested. And we were able, with the team at All3, to create a very competitive auction. And that's because fundamentally there was a lot of attraction in the business and in being invested in this sector. So I'm an optimist. I don't think that's changed. Obviously, we're in a difficult period right now, but if you're buying a business, you're not buying it for what's happening today. You're buying it for what you think is going to happen tomorrow. And I really, honestly, I think all of you are involved in an industry which is incredibly dynamic and still incredibly attractive to investors.
So All3Media, you've got a very beautiful house and a lot of people who want to buy it. Fine. What about if you're in a situation where, as you say, Jane, you're not even sure that the market is there for you? If there are 800 independents and 600 slots, that market simply isn't sustainable.
That's not a fact, by the way.
No, I'm just saying, but that's, as you say, without the transparency, we don't know. So transparency, I think, is one of the questions from this session about how can there be maybe a fairer terms of trade, I don't know. But Harry, what about consolidation beyond those big, frankly, pretty glossy players who are always going to create attention because of their amazing track record and, as you say, future optimism about what they're going to do? What about consolidation a bit lower down, and how should production companies be thinking about that future?
Well, it depends really on what the objective is. But if your objective is to create a sustainable business, one of the ways in which you can create a sustainable business is to consolidate, because you can share the costs across a bigger base. You can smooth out the dips. When you have a dip in revenue, you've got other things which fill in the gaps. And you can use it as a way to attract talent. So in my view, consolidation is a natural reaction to a world where your customers are largely consolidated, already very large, and will probably get larger. So, and broadcasting is a challenged industry, and there will be, in my view, fewer broadcasters in the future, linear broadcasters. But streaming services have also likely to kind of rationalize in some ways in terms of who they're targeting. So, in my mind, consolidation is a natural thing to do, but it's easy to say that. Obviously, it's a people business, so you have to figure out how you're going to work together and who gets what share of the business going forward. So it's not straightforward, but I think you're going to see, I know you're going to see further moves in consolidation in the production industry in the course of the next 12 months.
Richard, actually, Harry, I want to come back to you, but I just want to bring Richard in first. But Harry, I want to come back to you and have a little think about this. How do you even start thinking about how do I value my business? So that would be an interesting thing to have from you. Richard, you've had a little bit of distance now from being chairman of the BBC. You're back in, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. You're back in innovation. You're back in backing new technologies in SW7, not directly in the media. But with that little bit of hindsight, what is the role of the PSBs in this ecology? Could we start there and talk then about the market?
Well, look, I haven't been in the financial market for a number of years, but the financial markets tell you something. And one of the things that is worth looking at is what's happened to Netflix's share price and how much wealth has been created there. They've done a fabulous job. So for them, this last year, year to year, they've created over $100 billion of value for their shareholders. So they don't feel the way that you do, and they've done a spectacular job of developing wealth creation. They're up 40% so far this year to date, 70% year on year. And they obviously represent an incredibly important player in the marketplace. The good news for all of you, if you're thinking strategically, is more money is going to come into the industry globally. The question for all of you is, what is the ecosystem that capitalizes on the UK's competitive advantage and will continue to ensure that we don't get hollowed out in terms of our capabilities? And there's some good news. First of all, there's AI, there's technology. And it may be uncomfortable for some people, but that needs to be embraced and leveraged with skill. Secondly, we have English language. That's very important. And thirdly, coming to the point you're making, which is the critical role of the PSBs as a wellspring. It was no accident the two of you have worked for the BBC in the past. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if a majority of the people in the audience in some way have benefited from the procurement that the BBC provides and the competitive edge it gives us as a nation as a baseline of demand upon which we can build a global industry. So I'm optimistic, but I think we're in peril. So from a UK PLC point of view, not from a global industry. The question is, will we be hollowed out or will we have enterprise value here? And I think the Secretary of State is right to ensure that the skills that are created in this industry are distributed nationally, right across the nations, whether it's Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, or Wales. And the BBC is an essential part of that. But at the same time, the BBC has to do its job of making sure that its revenue drives into content procurement. And therefore, there's some very hard decisions on costs to be taken. And in addition, has to some degree a national preference when it comes to that procurement. So I think the opportunities are great. We have the competitive advantage. We have the companies. But I do think we're challenged. And I think policy will be quite important, and support for the BBC is an essential part of that, providing the BBC itself delivers on that challenge.
But to Jane's point, if you're talking about costs and the BBC is not able to have license fee agreements that allow it to continue fantastic commissioning in the way it may have thought it could do in the past, if it's not able to do that though, Richard, how can it maintain this role almost as a counter-cyclical player against some of the vagaries of the international market?
Well, look, I understand earlier today Tim was quite kind about me. Now, you could argue, if that's the case, I didn't do my job. Because in reality, Tim has to take some tough decisions. And the board should be requiring that, because change management is really hard. And hard decisions involves operating efficiencies, so you can have the commercial anxiety at the BBC, which is it requires the content to be competitive with the other players. It is asked to retain customers in order to justify the license fee. In order to do that, it has to have the content with which they will engage. In order to have that, it has to have the budget. To have the budget in constrained circumstances, it has to take tough decisions. So this generation of leadership definitely has to rise to that challenge.
Is your worry, Richard, that the BBC is spending too much on itself and not enough on producing great content?
I'm sure there are some very tough budget discussions taking place. There should be at the BBC, because the measure of its success is whether the audience is engaging with it. And as it's reported recently, in the face of significant competition, Charlotte, for example, doesn't have the budget she should have in order to give the content procurement a position for the BBC that people aren't declining in terms of their engagement with the BBC as a platform.
There's what they can do within the UK, and then there's what they can do abroad commercially and BBC Studios.
Yeah.
When you were at the BBC, was the BBC doing sufficient, or should it be doing more now? And Tim has obviously made this a big part of the future for the BBC, is how does it create very powerful commercial assets outside its public service
Well,
duties.
Look, first of all, Tim came into the DG position having run studios. And I joined just at that time, and it's pretty clear to me he'd done an outstanding job. At the same time, I ensured that BBC Studios had separate governance because it needed to operate as it does with private sector disciplines. And it's faced some of the pressures Jane's talking about. Whilst it's well run, it has a mandate to create value as an independent studio in effect. And I think they're doing a good job, but they're facing the same winter that the others have faced.
Jane, you're nodding, and I can hear
I
you
agree.
with agreement. Jane, do you want to respond at all directly about what Richard just said?
I agree with almost everything
Right.
Richard said.
Yes.
I think it's not, I don't think there's anyone in this room who honestly doesn't believe in the public service and the value that has in our ecology. I really don't. But how we practically, against the market forces, how we practically do that and keep those budgets at a level that's sustainable, I hope and I believe, and I know this is what the BBC and Channel 4 to a degree are doing, that the commissioning choices they make will sit in with cheaper, potentially newer talent who might not be quite as expensive. They'll have to take more risks on above-the-line talent. And that, as we know, can lead to great, great success. And they need to partner to do that. But they do need to have certainty in the long term. And that's the other thing I would say. If I'm sitting in the BBC, this constant, every 3 years or every 5 years, having to sort of beg for it, I would love to feel there's some certainty. And they can plan for that. And I completely support BBC Studios, the BritBox arrangement, and trying to be a meaningful global entity that actually brings value back to the BBC, which uses our incredible talent, but keeps it in the BBC in terms of its value and gives it back. I think I totally support that.
I mean, there's no doubt that when an employer looks about where they're going to set their enterprise, they think, what is the pool of talent in the community? So the BBC's training function is also incredibly important. So that for example, I was in financial services when it was regarded as the Wimbledonization of the financial services happened, but nevertheless, it allowed the UK to operate.
Just explain that for people who don't understand that.
Which is there are a small group of UK, it's how often do we have a Wimbledon winner, even though Wimbledon's taking place in the UK, that's British. But what we really want is we want a vibrant commercial operating sector here. So what we did post Big Bang is we had the right regulation that allowed talents to come from all over the world to the UK, to take advantage of the UK as a location, to create one of the world leading centres in financial services. We should aspire to exactly the same for the UK in the creative industries. And the way we do that is the right combination of policy, but a successful PSB has to be part of that, both as a trainer and for procurement. And there needs to be a policy issue, which may get to touch on the oligopsony of the consolidation that you're going to be part of, which is that's a collective group of equivalent of a buyer's oligopoly, oligopsony. So that issue in terms of IP in particular is potentially pernicious, that we get that balance right between the returns for the bigger platforms who are going to win, and they're not all winning. You only have to look what's happening to Paramount, Warner Brothers. So the Netflix success isn't just at the cost, if you like, but it's because they've been highly competitive with the consumers against some of the other players who didn't have the scale. But at the same time, we need to allow IP, the equity value that's created by the students, also the right balance of that to go to the producers.
Yeah.
And that's where the BBC has an advantage potentially now, because if they can get the budget working in a way that's we can still make programs, and that license allows us with distribution or with investment to own those rights, then we can start to build entrepreneurial businesses again, which is why the last 20 years, one of the reasons our industry has been so successful. And it definitely both psychologically and financially feels less exciting at the moment, because it feels a bit like, well, most of us don't want to be producers for hire. You want to actually build things and with partners. And so I think that, there's an opportunity.
The IP
there.
relationship
the
is
IP relationship
central.
is central.
Harry, let me bring you on the valuation issue. How do you even start thinking about, do I have a thing here? What is the future for it? And what can I do to ensure that it has a bright one?
Well, valuing a production business or a TV business in general is no different than valuing any other business. And that is that you look at the future rather than the past. The past is evidence of what you could potentially create in the future, but it's all about your future plans and how reliable and predictable it is. One of the things about IP ownership, as you've just been discussing, is it obviously underpins the future because you own the rights and you know that those rights are likely to continue to yield value in the years ahead. So those businesses with IP, typically in production, are going to be valued more highly than those who are just doing it at a margin. And so I think that's one of the things that obviously is any buyer is going to be focused on. And furthermore, there's going to be, it's all about the breadth of the business and the breadth of the customers. If you're dependent on one customer or a single customer, you're more likely to suffer in the future if they decide not to commission programming or go to one of your competitors. So a breadth of customer relationships is also important. So that, combined with talent and ability to develop talent within the group, as well as obviously having things that are coming down the pipeline. And when we sold all three, and previously I've sold Shine, actually they both got sold on more or less the same multiple for those who are interested, which is roughly 12 times EBITDA, or earnings before interest, tax, and depreciation. So there is a kind of set of precedents around which these businesses typically get sold. But like at selling anything, it's to do with the competition and those people who are actually in the auction room at the end. And that's, basically the job that people like me do, is to create competition around a business that allows you to optimize the outcome for the sellers. So, it's kind of a mix of things, but when you start fundamentally with a good business. And I think with all three in particular, and Shine before that, we had great businesses to sell.
I want to come to the audience in a few minutes for some questions, which would be great to have for our last 10 minutes of this session. Harry, Channel 4 and privatisation. What would be the upsides to Channel 4 being privatised for this wonderful, optimistic market future? I can already hear the murmurings of...
No, I know, I got to watch out, get my plastic jumper on here.
What could be the upsides of Channel 4 being privatised?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that we were involved, potentially working for the government. It was a political decision, and we were hired to do a job. And to be honest, at the time, I was very optimistic. I would be less optimistic today, given what's actually happened since the decision not to go ahead was taken. But I was very optimistic that we could not only achieve a good price for the government, but we could also impose on the buyers conditions that would have allowed many of the things that Channel 4 and all of you hold dear about Channel 4 to survive. So I simply don't believe that it was like you either privatized and all hell, it was Channel 4 lost everything that it was good at, or you stayed as it was. And again, politicians had to decide what they wanted to do. But again, in an auction process, you can impose conditions on buyers if they really want to own the business. And we were in a position potentially to do that. There was a lot of interest in Channel 4, and I can absolutely tell you that it would have come with a series of conditions that would have protected the interests of a lot of the people here. And
could have brought more money into production? Because why would you do it
because if we had been successful, which I felt we would have been, in getting a competitive process together, we could have required, the government could have required the bidders to make certain commitments around future spend. Ironically, one of the things we felt was important was that the Channel 4 should be allowed to own some of its IP. What has happened since is that they've now argued, even though at the time they felt Channel 4 felt it wasn't important, they've subsequently argued that it would be very helpful. Thank you very much. So I know everyone here probably wants to, argue with that point, but I don't think it was the death knell of Channel 4 that you all hold so dearly. And anyway, it's academic, it didn't happen, so.
Yeah. Jane, Secretary of State is going to be speaking a little bit later on. Give us a couple of things for her in tray.
Wow.
That she can do. She can do.
She's taking notes at the back, actually.
That can be done by this new government where the mood, the atmospherics, as you might describe it, has changed in terms of, where the government is vis-a-vis public service broadcasters. There's definitely a change of tone. But Jane, they're new.
Well, I think the narrative change of tone is critical. We discussed this. I do think that the BBC in particular needs to be able to say when it does things really well as often as when it doesn't do things really well. I think it should be valued, and I do think the narrative around that will change with Lisa. I believe it will. I think she understands it, but she's then going to hold it to account, which will be, and I would agree with this, if you're going to ensure that license fee or a certainty of funding, whatever version that looks like in the future, that there are requirements absolutely for regionality, the nations and the regions, and new talent and the training. The BBC already does an enormous amount of that, but I think has to be held to account to do. So I hope they'll do that. I also hope they start to value arts, the grassroots arts in our country, because we're all here because we have an interest in, either we loved music, we love television, these are grassroots arts, and the value that has been placed on arts in the last 14 years has, to my mind, has diminished its role in our society, and as people are coming through without an education which values the arts, I think that's critical to long-term health of our nation and our cultural identity. Yeah.
Is there anything the government should be doing on transparency, on IP, on regulation of that via Ofcom, or is there more? Or
we were talking about this. The IP situation is interesting, isn't it? So I think there's a conversation to be had around that. Richard's got some points of view on that as well, haven't you?
Richard?
But, whether or not we can somehow create a new...
Well, look, this is an issue that's been faced by other industries. You have to look at the art industry, the music industry, how the creator can capture the equity value of the specific value that they create through the IP, how that can be enduring, and it's not captured by the distributor. So I think there can be some novel ways to look at rebalancing. And
with the government role in that in some way to think about.
And it'll be more than one government.
Yeah. Richard, licence fee?
Well, look, I think that what the BBC represents in terms of the sub is value, but I do think, and I've said this in the past, I think there's room for categorising different consumers differently, so that some pay more than others, because I think there's a national purpose in media being delivered to create social cohesion, and also that should be available. Now, there's a lot of freely available media, but I think that we want the BBC to be available as well, with a different kind and quality of media from time to time. So I think there will be some challenges on the universal provision, but at the same time, there's probably room for the BBC license fee to go up in the future, and provided the constraints the Secretary of State are met where it fulfills its non-commercial duties.
So a tiered license fee, if I'm hearing you correctly, dependent on how much use you make of BBC services subscription?
Look, my own view is that it should be tied, for example, to the value of your house or council house banding or those kinds of
an income tiered?
Yes, I think so, absolutely.
Means tested?
Well, in effect, there are ways to do that. The Germans do it differently as well. So I think there are some creative mechanisms for the review.
Excellent. Let's go to questions. Sadly, there are no microphones on the top floor, which is a great shame, and I can only apologise for that. But down here, I can see there's a hand right here, and then someone, towards the back there. Yes, please. Yes.
Hi there, Tara Conlan. I write for the RTS and the Guardian. You talked about the Secretary of State's going to be talking about the future of the BBC and mutualisation. I just wondered, the BBC was on the asset portfolio list in 2009, BBC Worldwide was, and there's been talk about BBC Worldwide being privatised in, I think, 2015. How much would you value studios at, Harry? Do you think it could become privatised? Are there enough mechanisms in place, or is it too difficult for that to happen?
No, I don't think it's too difficult. I mean, clearly there's a relationship with the BBC that would need to be, carefully set out. But no, I think the BBC, again, it's the BBC represents what it sells through BBC Worldwide is fantastic content that has an audience around the world. So that is, I believe that could be sold. I'm not saying whether it should be sold. I mean, the BBC gets a lot of income from BBC Worldwide, so it probably doesn't want to. But it always strikes me as odd that a publicly funded vehicle is competing in a commercial market. I just find that fundamentally an unfair, level playing field. So that's, if you ask me sort of philosophically, I would say that I
Richard, are
believe
you
it should be.
as uncomfortable with that?
No.
No, me neither.
Look, I think one of the benefits of having that as an adjunct to the BBC is it brings a commercial mentality into the organisation, which it needs to have. There's a reason the BBC is more successful than any other public service broadcaster. It's because it has the talents that come. Tim is a good example of that, moving across. So I think that the studios, providing it doesn't suffocate in any way and act uncompetitively, I think it is of great value to the nation, and the benefits of it go through to the public service in form of dividends.
Thank you, Tara. Towards the back there. Thank you. Hello. Do introduce yourself.
Hi, it's Kenton Allen from Big Talk Studios. Because there's been lots of talk about next generation talent here, and I suppose the consensus at the moment is you'd be mad to start an independent production business and try and grow it and sell it because of the way the market has moved. I guess I'm wondering what the next Jane Featherstone or the next Annie Harris or the next Nicola Schindler, what the options are for those young individuals who want to start IP generating and owning businesses. Because at the moment, the consensus in our generation is don't do it. So how are we going to keep this independent production sector growing with these highly entrepreneurial individuals? What are the options for them?
Jane?
Thanks, Kenton. I think when we all started doing it, which, I don't know, 25 years ago or something, there weren't that many of us. And the market was in a very different place. So of the 100% of the pie, we could between us take 75%, and that meant we could build businesses. The market's changed so much, as we know. So I don't think that, I don't see doom and gloom forever. I think we are honestly in a transitional moment, and I think the rights position will change. The market forces will require that in some shape or form. I don't know exactly what that will look like, but I do believe in the next 2 or 3 years there will be a shift where value comes back to the producers, and producers are valued again in that way. So I would find a partner, find a home, one of the bigger ones now, learn your trade there, and then go out, which is also what we did as well. Ultimately, we started with somebody who already had something, learned, and then set up our own businesses. So I think starting brand new on your own as a baby in this environment is really hard, but find people you trust and like and you can learn from, and that's how we can nurture that talent, make that short-term relationship, bust out and do it yourself when the market's evolved into a different place. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Jane. Yep, at the back there.
Hi, Steve Morrison. I think the biggest issue is turning away from the last 14 years of chipping away at the BBC. So during the 14 years of consecutive Conservative governments, they took about £1 billion out of the BBC, roughly. That had an impact on their ability and volume of commissioning. And therefore, the press, which is largely anti the BBC, has kept Conservative governments keeping the BBC down. Now, because the BBC is probably the most important instrument for commissioning from the independent sector alongside the other PSBs and Sky and so on, if you keep the BBC down, you're really losing the largest weapon to get the independent sector volume up. And because it's a public method of funding, it's not as subject to the danger of what's happening in the commercial market.
Can I hear a question coming?
Yes. The question is, should we not be encouraging the government to expand the BBC rather than following the press to reduce it?
Don't look at...
Richard.
Look, I work with Steve.
Yep.
Steve, you should know, is a former non-executive director of the BBC. Obviously, I agree that the BBC is a critical competitive advantage, and I think Steve makes the point it's a counter-cyclical one as well, which also gives us value. So yes, the BBC needs to be supported. As I said, BBC has a duty to fulfill its obligation and should be run as aggressively and efficiently as possible, but it should be supported.
Yeah. Steve, you know how much I love you, but also as now working back in the commercial sector, it's hard work up against a behemoth that is the BBC at times, just to say that. Just last question down here.
Thank you very much. John McVeigh from Pact. How many indies is a big question. Is it oversupplying the market? Well, I've been at Pact 23 years. I know it doesn't look it. When I first started, I had 1,400 members. We've now got 850. Just before the pandemic, we had 500, and actually we opened up membership. So it's not a question of numbers and how many slots. My main focus, and I think it's a question Jane's touched on, and certainly a lot of conversations I've had over the past few months, it's not the number, it's who are the indies. Where do they come from? Where are the voices? Who is getting a chance to enter the industry and grow a business and sell it on or grow on all three media? Who are these people? How are they going to get in? That's the question, not the number.
So a similar type of question, really, Jane, isn't it?
I mean, the number thing, John, obviously, I'm sure your statistics are right with that. But, and I don't know, it would be interesting to know, wouldn't it, how many commissions there were then? But you're right. Basically, what you're saying is more commissions going to fewer producers, which I guess as budgets have been rising, the stakes are higher. There's more international work, more work with the US. They trust fewer, bigger producers, whether that's right or wrong, but that's how the market has evolved. So I think it's hard to turn the tide back from that, apart from, I know Channel 4 has obviously its scheme with younger producers, and the BBC tries to do that, but the market is so much more complicated than it was 5, 10, 3 years ago, actually, that I think you need safety in a storm. And I would argue that if I were a buyer, I would probably want to be very careful about who I was giving money to. But those people have a responsibility to make sure that we throw the ladder down and bring up that generation, which is what the first thing I said on this stage. So I believe that, but I think we have to be realistic that, when we're working with Netflix at big budget shows, they're not always going to feel comfortable giving that amount of money to a first-time producer. That's just the reality. And the budgets have, we're talking big numbers now. So I think we have to be realistic as well. But we have to support each other to bring up the best talent.
We've come to the end. Some tough times we've had as an industry, but a brighter future ahead. All this money is going to start flowing back. Richard,
thanks, Harry.
You promised to us, and Harry, you're going to do some great deals for many, many people in this room and make us all a lot of money, we hope. Thank you so much to Harry, to Jane, and to Richard. Thank you as well.